When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Static in the Storm. User: GL35. Posted February 9th, 1996.
It was the kind of cold, gray day that makes you long for summer's warmth. The skies were heavy with snow, but the kind that sat in limbo, having yet to decide if it was coming or going. Inside our little house, the kids were buzzing with excitement over my teen David's latest find, an old ham radio he bought for $3 at a garage sale. Allie and Sam thought it was the coolest thing ever, and David promised them he'd get it working as soon as he could so they'd have something to do on these nasty days. I should have stopped him. Lord knows I had enough on my plate without adding the antics of an antique radio to the mix, but seeing them happy for once, especially with all they'd been through, softened my heart. David, at 15, had become too much like his father, quiet, brooding, and serious beyond his years. Allie, just 13, had stepped into a mothering role she shouldn't have had to carry, and Sam, sweet Sam, was too young to remember his mama, but old enough to feel her absence. Letting them have this one thing seemed heartless enough at the time. David worked on it all afternoon as his younger siblings watched, crouched around the dusty, scratched-up machine like archaeologists uncovering a relic. He fiddled with knobs and wires, his face scrunched up in concentration, while Allie offered suggestions and Sam provided an endless stream of enthusiasm. I kept half an eye on them from the kitchen where I was kneading dough for dinner rolls. Every now and then the radio crackled, spitting static that reminded me of rain on a tin roof, followed by Sam's gleeful cheers that it's working before being shut down by his older brother. It wasn't until evening, after the dishes were done and the kids had eaten their fill, that the old electronic dinosaur truly came alive. David was the first to notice. "Hey," he said, leaning closer, his brow furrowed. "I think I've finally got something." Allie and Sam rushed around him as I dried my hands on a dish towel and stepped into the living room. The static had shifted, grown sharper, like it was trying to say something. Then, faint and crackly, a voice emerged. "Coordinates," it said, the word distorted but unmistakable. "Need help. Storm." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Turn it off, David," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "But Grandma," he protested, his hand hovering over the dial. "What if it's real? What if someone needs help?" God, he reminded me of his father, always the hero. "It's probably just an old recording," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. turn it off." Reluctantly, he obeyed, and the room fell silent except for the sound of the wind rattling the windows. The kids' excitement faded into a quiet moodiness that settled over the house like a blanket, to which I then informed them it was time to get showered and ready for bed. But then, that night, after they were asleep, I found myself drawn back to the living room. The radio still sat on the coffee table, a silent sentinel in the dim light, pulling me to it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the device, the memory of that voice from earlier echoing in my mind. I thought about my son, halfway across the world in the Persian Gulf, and the weight he carried. Losing his wife had nearly broken him, and I'd been terrified the grief would swallow him whole. Instead, he'd thrown himself into his work, volunteering for deployments in Bosnia, then back to the Middle East, anything to avoid coming home to an empty house and the ghosts that lingered there. I'd hoped this little Idaho town where my family had lived for generations, with its quiet streets and wide open skies, would be a sanctuary for my grandkids, but it seemed the shadows had followed them here too. Then, against my better judgment, I turned the radio on. I couldn't help it. I just felt drawn to it, and as soon as it clicked on and the tube started glowing, static filled the room. Soft and insistent, like the whisper of someone trying to get my attention. I twisted the dial, listening for anything, a voice, a signal, a sign. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint and crackling, it came back. Storm, coordinates. The voice was clearer this time, more urgent. "Please, someone, help." My hands trembled as I reached for the dial, turning the radio off with a sharp click. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I stood there for a long time, staring at the machine, my mind racing. Who was it? Where were they? And why did their voice make me feel like they were speaking directly to me? The next day, I told the kids the radio was broken and put it in the attic. They didn't argue, though David gave me a look that said he didn't believe me. As much as I wanted it to be, I knew that this was not over. Later that night, at around 1 a.m, I woke up to the sound of static, the same rain on the roof tone I heard before. My heart pounded as I climbed out of bed and hesitantly made my way to the attic. The radio was on, its tube glowing faintly in the dark. The voice was back, clearer than ever. Storm coordinates. It paused, then spoke again, louder this time. "Help, please." The attic seemed to spin around me as I stared at the machine. This was no recording. This was someone or something trying to reach me, but why and how? Summoning all the courage I could muster, I leaned forward and turned the dial, trying to respond. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. "Who is this?" For a moment, there was only static. Then, faint and distorted, the voice came through again. "It's too late. They're here." My heart dropped into my stomach as the radio went silent. I waited, hoping for more, but neither the static or the voice returned. Aside from the wind and wood creaks of the old house, the attic was quiet, the air heavy with a sense of finality. I turned off the radio and climbed back down the ladder. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who had been on the other end of that signal? What storm were they talking about, and who or what had arrived?
Subject: The Hanged Man. User: N10D3. Posted June 1st, 1994.
Several years ago, I relocated my family to Athens, Georgia to take advantage of a job offer from UGA. Now, in order to keep this reasonably anonymous, all I can say is that I'm an educator and someone who considers themselves resolutely rational. My parents raised me in the Christian faith, so my belief system has some room for magical thinking, but I've never gone in for things like ghosts. Our experience in our new house, however, have me rethinking that. My daughter, we'll call her Zelda or Zell for short, wasn't happy about moving. She was just entering her teen years when I got this job and found the notion of leaving her friends behind distressing. I get it, I was a kid once too, but the upsides of being here in Athens for all of us far outweighed the pain of leaving friends behind. Athens is a college town and has culture to spare, especially for Zell, who's a fan of live music. Once I had taken her to a couple shows at Friolaro's and the 40 Watt, she started to come around. At 3 stories, the house is way too big for the two of us, but I guess I thought the additional space might help to make up for some of the disruption moving had brought to Zell's life. To sweeten the deal, we converted one of the bedrooms into an art studio so she could develop her skills as a painter. It was something she used to share with her mother and, to my relief, had continued enjoying after Kelly passed. Zell's studio is on the 3rd floor next to the staircase, and that's where the trouble started. One night, I had been out with some colleagues at the Uptown Lounge until about 11, and when I came home, the television was turned up so loud I could hear it outside in the driveway. When I walked in, Zell was curled up on the living room couch, her arms hugged tightly around her knees as some old Vic Morrow TV movie blared away in the background. I went to her right away, but she wouldn't speak, at least not at first. Some kids shout or cry when they're upset, but Zell goes inside. Kelly used to do the same thing, and it was actually more upsetting than screaming or crying. I know how to put out a fire. But when Kelly would go inside herself, coaxing her out was a much more delicate process because all it would take was one wrong word to send her back where she'd been. Zell wasn't quite as bad as that, but getting her to speak about what was on her mind still took time, and it was almost 30 minutes before she would speak. She said that a couple hours before, she had been in the studio painting when she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I told her not to expect me home until 11:30, but she assumed I'd come back early and came out to greet me. Of course, I wasn't home and there was no one there. Assuming she'd been mistaken, she went back to painting, but the footsteps returned, louder and heavier. Again, she left her studio to see if I was home, but the house was empty and silent. Her concentration broken, she left the studio light on and came downstairs to watch television, but the footsteps continued stomping up and down with no obvious cause. Zell said the stomping had become so loud and fierce that she panicked and turned up the TV to drown it out. It had worked off and on, but In the movie's quieter moments, the sounds were still audible and the fear had completely overwhelmed her. I felt terrible. It wasn't unusual for me to have the odd night out, as schmoozing is an unavoidable part of academia, but maybe I should have waited before leaving Zell alone in the new house. Together, we checked all the doors and windows, and seeing they were intact seemed to help put her at ease. I told her that in the future, I'd make sure there'd be a list of phone numbers so she could call me wherever I happened to be. After she went to bed, I stayed downstairs and thought about the whole thing. Zell wasn't the kind of kid who lost her cool over nothing. If she says she heard footsteps, I believed her, but there wasn't much room in that resolutely rational mindset for another explanation. In the end, I packed it away as one of life's little mysteries and went to bed. The following weeks were quiet, and Zell seemed like she was adapting well to our new circumstances. She even made friends with some girls from school, Beth, Brittany, and Tally, who seemed like genuinely good kids. One Saturday night in early May, she asked if I minded her staying over at Tally's house, and I was only too happy to let her go. Having the house to myself was strange for the first few hours, and when I sat with it for a bit, I realized it was because it was my first time totally alone since Kelly had died. The thought didn't sit well with me, so rather than relax into the silence, I decided to get some grading done upstairs in my office. The footsteps started maybe an hour later. In the beginning, I did exactly what Zell had done. Thinking she had forgotten something and come home, I went out into the hallway to greet her and found it empty. I called out and for a split second thought I'd heard something move downstairs. Nothing definite, maybe paper rustling together or the blinds clicking against one another, but it passed as quickly as it began. Mystified, I went back into my office, closing the door behind me. The steps returned immediately, harder and faster. I rushed out into the corridor to try and catch what had to be an intruder in my home, but there was nothing to see. The footsteps didn't stop this time, though. They stomped harder and harder up the stairs in a rhythm that sounded like an invisible army was on the march. The intensity increased to the point I felt as though the walls were shaking and I might lose my mind if it didn't stop. Screwing up my nerve, I ran down the stairs, half expecting to collide with someone or multiple someones, but instead, all that happened was the sound abruptly stopped. It didn't return again that day, but I now know that Zell hadn't imagined her experience. I just had to figure out what was happening. The answer came from an unlikely place. One of my colleagues, I'll call him Dell, is a bit of a savant when it comes to physics, and despite that very much not being my field, we bonded over a shared love of the music of Tom Waits. I kept riding my bike to work a little too far into autumn, and one afternoon the rains came on so hard and fast that Dell gave me a lift home. When we turned onto my street, Dell pointed out our house and said something to the effect of, "Boy, I sure hope that ain't your place." When I said that was, in fact, our house, the smile on his face dropped away. He asked if I was serious and then tried to wave it off as a joke, but I started pushing. It took a good 10 minutes of refusing to get out of his car, but I got him to talk. Dell said that the house had previously belonged to another professor from a different department. He said that the man had gone through a nasty divorce and, rather than starting over, decided to take his own life. He'd hung himself in the stairwell during summer break, and it had been weeks before anyone found him. Since then, Dell said the house had gone through a number of different owners, and no one ever seemed to want to stay. I decided not to share my experiences with Del, but instead thanked him for telling me. He looked sheepish, like he'd really messed up, but I told him I'd rather know than not. Besides, I said he was a physicist. Physicists don't believe in ghosts. He chuckled at that. Zell doesn't know about any of this, and I'm not planning to tell her. Rational mindset or no, reality is reality, and we both experienced the furious steps in the same place a man took his life. I'm going to propose we look for a new house together on the premise that I'd like something closer to campus and hope we can get ourselves organized before the footsteps happen again.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.